Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week on the show, we feature an interview with two anarchists in Southern California about the recent resistance to federal-led immigration raids in Los Angeles and the wider region. Both guests speak about their experiences working in rapid response structures to immigration raids, to anti-homeless sweeps, and other community needs over the years and how they've changed as conditions and technologies have changed. We also talked about inviting and engaging new activists and some strategies that have shown success in the streets.
My name is Ben. I use he and him. I'm based in the Inland Empire, which is about an hour and beyond east of LA in Southern California. My day job is at a nonprofit organization that works in immigrant rights. And I do mostly the legal side of things, but I've been an organizer for probably 25 years now, something like that. Mostly on immigrant rights, but been active on many other issues as well. And so that's, pretty much me.
I've been doing activism in the greater Los Angeles area for some years now. Yeah, I've been involved in rapid response work, been involved in a lot of mutual aid work as well. And I guess I'll keep it at that.
Well, the next question is about getting a little more detailed into the sort of work that you do, but you can obviously answer as you want to. But yeah, I wonder if you're working around rapid response around similar communities, or do you want to name the communities that you're working around? Should we leave it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have some folks that consolidated around SoCal in general, actually. And actually, this is kind of how Ben and I became associated, was through a number of folks who have been mobilizing around issues such as immigrants' rights, but also such as, responding to homeless sweeps, including like a major sweep that happened a few months ago that we rallied a lot of people around. Yeah, I mean, I guess in January, we had folks that really became concerned about how bad it was going to get. Obviously, we were right. So immigrants' rights was the main issue. But we were also like, hey, they're coming after people, and they've been coming after people, regardless if we're talking the Trump administration or anybody else, right? It's not Obama still has the record for deportations, and then just the situation with homeless sweeps in California in particular. I mean, all over the country, but this is kind of an inflection point. So that there were a lot of folks who were like, hey, rapid response around immigration stuff is the most important thing. But what if we also just got a network of people together that just on a broad spectrum to show up and try to make life a little bit easier for the people most impacted.
Yeah, it's I think a similar skill set, right? Rapid response for what? For the sweeps that they do against our unhoused community, the immigration raids that have been going on like crazy, especially the last week or so. But also, when the fascists attack, or with the emergencies, right? With the fires that you were talking about earlier. That's the kind of thing that requires a rapid response, and especially when we can't or refuse to depend on government, basically.
Yeah, to go off of that, that definitely played a role. We had just huge groups of people come together to just start mobilizing goods around the city. I mean, this happens. You hear about this happening all over the country, all over the world when disasters happen, and a lot of those networks never went away, right? We had folks that just were like, hey, why don't we just repurpose this from that effort we had to this new effort? And that's been helpful.
As far as I go, like I said, my day job is doing the immigrant rights stuff. The organization I work with has had a long-standing commitment to the people who are detained in the Adelanto Detention Center. And so I've taken on, doing that work of visitation, the bond hearings, and the removal defense, especially for people that are locked up and asylum seekers. But I've also been doing rapid response since, forever, pretty much, responding to reports of immigration, filming those, documenting those, doing intake, interviewing the families affected or witnesses, trying to get them the resources they need, whether it's legal resources or just the stuff that you need because, your main breadwinner has just been picked up. And so I think that's also one of the ways where there's been that interface, right? Because immigrant rights folks have been doing this for a long time. And so we were able to kind of transfer some of that to the people that are coming new on the scene and just learning, about rapid response, what it is, how it works, what doesn't work, that sort of thing. But yeah, and also activism, right? Like throwing down in the streets and organizing and doing what we can to keep people safe while we're out there.
I can see a lot of Venn diagram like overlaps between all these sorts of types of engagement, whether it be like showing up because the police are messing with a crowd of people, or because an immigration raid, as you said, or like connections between the mutual aid stuff that was going on in 2020 because of COVID, and then this would have pre-existed the COVID pandemic, but the sort of like community mobilizations to provide food or transportation for families that were worried about immigration raids at grocery stores, at workplaces, at like people's schools or whatever. It seems like that sort of rapid response or rapidly responding to like reports of FASH showing up in the street. Yeah, that's super interesting and useful, I think, to point to those connections. And also there's like, I'm sure, like not to go too much on this, but the overlapping Venn diagrams between houseless communities and also undocumented folks. There are going to be people that are in both of those camps, so to speak, right? Could folks talk a little bit about both of those issues, the issues of homeless sweeps in the California context? The California context is a little bit different than other places in its official stances around participation in, as far as I understand, or maybe it's just city by city, but working with immigration and customs enforcement. Like the way that Trump talks about it, California is this place that's absolutely overrun on the streets by people sleeping rough or whatever all the time. And then also that it's a bastion of a lack of enforcement around immigration laws or harassment of potentially undocumented folks by law enforcement. Are like, how would you respond to that supposition?
I can speak to that to start, if you don't mind, Ben. I just wanted to jump in because it's I work a lot with the unhoused community and the unhoused communities, and I think it's important to start with the United States and California on its own. Like law enforcement set up in this very patchwork system, right? And so it's like California in general is a quote unquote sanctuary state, but like each law enforcement agency has kind of like a different approach to how they deal with unhoused people, how they deal with undocumented people. And I think that you see even those ones that are like very, we have a policy, like LAPD has a policy against being involved, but like we've caught them numerous times having some involvement, and then they'll backtrack and be like, okay, well, we weren't really involved. Like this is really what we were doing. So, but then there's other agencies where it's like, yeah, they just pretty much are openly collaborating. I've seen that in some of the work that I've done in some of the unincorporated Los Angeles County. And then I can speak to, it's interesting because it felt at first like unhoused folks seemed somewhat inoculated from these raids because they were just targeting, people at their jobs. They were targeting people showing up at the obvious places, right? That you would expect if they're profiling people, Home Depot, places like that, street corners, And then I did definitely see people who were like, hey, we want, information, we want infographics. And then more recently, what I've started seeing is, and I can't speak to like confirmations, but I can speak to like some of the rapid response networks who have pointed things out, and some of the unhoused residents that I work with that have pointed things out where, yeah, like I have at least one report of potentially ICE showing up and tailing a homeless sweep and using that as an opportunity to sweep people up. I know that there's at least one confirmed report of unhoused resident in Bell getting abducted by ICE, and then we also have had I've had people in unhoused communities tell me like, hey, like, you know, I'm first of all, I'm noticing like less and like a lot less people when I'm doing outreach coming up, particularly a lot less people who don't speak very good English coming up, you know. So like I have various communities who speak primarily other languages, and I'm seeing less of them lately, and I'm hearing from people that know and care about them that, hey, they're deeper in the wilderness areas that they inhabit. Or I'm, you know, seeing, I just saw a community that was fairly frazzled because they live in a unhoused encampment just next to a Home Depot, and they're telling me reports of like, hey, just 2 days ago, 30 people were taken at a raid, and 2 of them were our friends, and yeah, we really want to get that information out there. And a lot of the people that are like, hey, we want Know Your Rights materials are not the people you would expect, you know. A lot of them are very much people who you're like, I don't know where you stand kind of politically, but like they care about their community and they don't want to see them getting abducted.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's definitely an overlap, right? Like those videos have been surfacing last couple of days of ICE out on, probably not on Skid Row, but just encampments and kind of picking up some of the low hanging fruit that's out there because they're vulnerable, they're exposed, they're out there. And in some ways, undocumented people have more protections in a state like California than unhoused people do. You know, I did a lot of work. I spent 10 years doing tenants' rights, informing tenants of their rights. And we always would start with about how, you know, there's no constitutional right to housing or either in the U.S. Constitution or East California Constitution or any of the state laws or anything like that. If you get into a place, then, you know, you have some rights under your lease, and then there's habitability laws and stuff like that. But there's no right to housing. And that's even gotten worse, right, with the Grants Pass ruling. And it just kind of opens the door for abuse to the unhoused community. And like, Know Your Rights, for example, like I can give a whole lecture on know your right. What are your rights as an immigrant, right? At your home, your workplace, out on the street, in a vehicle, whatever. But what are your rights as an unhoused person? That's a very short lecture, you know, like we still have First Amendment, I guess, you know, and even the tolerance too, like even just the folks in the community. I think there's a lot more pro-immigrant sentiment than there is any kind of sympathy or love for our unhoused sisters and brothers, you know, which is really sad, you know, in many ways. In some ways, it's created a lot of protection for the people who are here who don't have any immigration status. But it's interesting to see that, you know, there's that difference, right? And in some ways, that overlap, and the big overlap is the poverty, right? Even more so than like the racial issues. But despite that, is like, I don't know, the communities or activist groups respond differently. Community, you know, respond differently to unhoused person living on the street or in crisis versus, you know, the crisis that's going on right now to our undocumented or, you know, semi-documented community.
Yeah, definitely agree on the rights side of things. I actually spend a decent amount of time putting together materials and helping educate unhoused communities on their rights. I meet people also at the intersection of, and let me be clear, like most, at least half of unhoused folks do not use substances, but I'm particularly oftentimes I mainly work with people at the intersection of substance use and homelessness. And so I spend a lot of time handing people, you know, materials to keep themselves safe and alive and healthy, and also educating them on, you know, hey, the stuff that I'm giving you, you're legally allowed to possess, because they do have those rights in California. And the same goes for giving them materials on how to deal with like when they get swept. That said, you know, much like with people who right now are dealing with, and this is, you know, mostly the new stuff going on, right? Like we're seeing people who will assert their rights and still get abducted, will assert their rights and have their window broken and they'll be pulled out of their car, you know, they'll have ICE break into their house. This is newer to that community, whereas the unhoused community, I don't know how many lawsuits have been won reaffirming that unhoused people's property is not to be taken, and they continue doing it anyways, both at a federal and a state level. And the same with the paraphernalia. You know, they are legally allowed to possess paraphernalia that we give them because we're giving it to them for a public health and safety reason. and yet and still they'll get ticketed and arrested for possession of pipes and needles and things of that nature.
Yeah, and just coming back to the question of sanctuary and the way that it's kind of plays out in different areas or different communities, we have the state law that is really clear about setting those limits that local law enforcement can collaborate with federal immigration enforcement. But that doesn't mean that the local police departments have the same level of tolerance for, say, day laborers, who are looking for work out on the streets outside of the Home Depot or at other informal hiring sites, or street vendors, even though we have had a series of laws to decriminalize street vending and to bring the food retail code up to date, to allow for more access to people to be able to make their livings doing sidewalk vending, street vending, that sort of thing. But the cities aren't necessarily providing those business licenses or making it easier. They're doing, some of them are requiring $1 million insurance policies, putting up those kind of barriers. Why? Because they don't want to see street vendors on their streets, or they're very restrictive about where they're allowed to do that kind of that business, even though under the law they're not supposed to have unreasonable restrictions. And I think it's similar to when it comes to the encampments, right? There are some cities that are look the other way. They're like kind of give up. We're going to be one of those cities where people are basically, they can live unsheltered, and then maybe that has a benefit to the city in the sense that nonprofits, resources come in and kind of get centralized there, and there's a benefit to the general community because of that. But most of this, like the affluent cities, they're basically go police state, and they see unhoused folks walking in or driving in. They have laws against parking on the street, especially parking overnight. They're just anti-poor laws. And then there's the cities that are maybe either too big or break, and they say, okay, we'll allow this type of activity in this part of town on these side of the tracks, so to speak, but we're going to keep the white areas or the rich areas white and rich, and that they use the police to do that.
I mean, I guess I was going to get to Newsom a little bit later on with some of the changes. And I do want to talk about like the political rifts that occur between him and Trump or the different administrations. But like my understanding is that last year Newsom was spearheading this initiative to at least reward cities for running sweeps, and if not, I'm not sure if he was going to be punishing, like sort of in the way that like cities will punish people if there is graffiti, and like they'll punish like property owners or like neighborhoods or whatever if there's graffiti present that doesn't get cleaned up. It kind of reminded me of like the human version of what Newsom was doing, like threatening punishment or at least rewarding cities for undermining houseless communities. Is that like a fair description of the changes over the last couple of years with that?
I think so. I think that's pretty fair. I think there was like some degree to where he kind of like was vaguely threatening, but ultimately it was more of like we're going to reward cities that follow through on this, and like maybe also like potentially punish them by not giving them funding. But yeah, I mean, he's gone back and forth, and I'm not up to date with the latest thing, because I know I'm trying to remember, but there was something more recently that he had done and said, I think. But yeah, I mean, overall, he was actively lobbying for for the Grants Pass ruling well before the Grants Pass ruling happened. And then, also, it's important to note that Gavin Newsom's been buddying up with a lot of far-right individuals lately, going on podcasts with like Charlie Kirk and Steve Bannon. So it's kind of unsurprising that he's listening to these kind of voices. It's kind of unsurprising that he's moving in that direction. It's interesting too, because I think part of it is I've looked at some of the legislation that he has put together since he's been governor, and it's interesting with the first piece of homelessness legislation he did. It was related to like getting more shelters built and things of that nature. And it almost feels like he kind of got jaded by the fact that it wasn't happening on the timeline that he wanted. So then he decided, well, then if that's not going to work, I'm just going to start punishing people. So, but yeah, I mean, he's been kind of one of the standard bearers for punitive action against unhoused communities for their very existence. How
has immigrant solidarity work been shifting in the last couple of months, and in particular couple of weeks, with shifts in the federal approach? And I wonder if you could talk about changes in the federal approach towards quote unquote immigration enforcement?
There's like a playbook, right? Stephen Miller wrote this. I think he wrote part of Horizon 2025. Thank you. And he's a lawyer, and he's studied immigration, and he had everything like pretty much planned out about what the changes he wanted to make were, and a lot of those were implemented the last time. So a lot of the changes have been in things that they can do without going through Congress, through executive order, and through the way that the current immigration laws that are already on the books are applied or are enforced. So it's just been like almost every day, especially the first month or so, like multiple executive orders, decrees, that sort of thing, just making life a lot more difficult for undocumented people. So that's on one side, and like these are the laws and these are what people are expected to comply with. And then on the other side is what is actual immigration enforcement. And actually, I don't really like to use that term because it kind of puts people in the mindset of like law must be enforced, right? I like to more phrase it as like repression, because really that's what it is. But so what does the repression actually look like? And it's people, armed people with guns, right, going out and taking people. And we saw it even before the inauguration with this large-scale Border Patrol raid up in Kern County, up at Bakersfield area, when Bakersfield is nowhere near the border, right? But they were considering the coast a border. And I think that was a little bit of a preview of what was to come, because they were going to the day labor hiring sites outside of Home Depot. They were going to the fields, the agricultural fields, and racially profiling people. And then, just basically rounding people up and taking them down to El Centro and detaining them there and pressuring a lot of them into signing their own quote unquote voluntary departure paperwork and just kicking people right out. And some people fought it and are still fighting it. And there's an ACLU lawsuit about that. And that's the kind of thing that we used to see back in 2008, especially out in our area and before, just Border Patrol using race or like a economic profile of a worker just to stop people, sometimes even using force, pressuring them to signing their rights away and detaining people. And that's part of what the purpose of detention is too, right? They use detention, especially the threat of prolonged detention, as a way to intimidate people and pressure them into signing their rights away. Sometimes they just violate people's rights without caring about what the laws actually say or what their rights are. And sometimes they're a little bit more careful. So I don't know. It's what can I say? It's just been very, very aggressive. It's been escalatory. And I think the approach, to me, it shows that Trump cares more about confrontation, about stoking a response from quote unquote liberal California than he cares about deporting people. Because if he really cared about deporting people, he could deport a lot of people the way that Obama did, which was silently and with a smile on his face. Whereas, by using this very aggressive tactics, people are coming out on the streets in a way that they didn't when it was like these kind of behind the scenes 287G agreements between local sheriff's departments all over the country and ICE. Of course, California fought back against that and created the sanctuary law at the beginning of Trump era, not during Obama's time. But in some ways, this tactic, this very hyperly aggressive, macho, masculine, I got something to prove thing has provoked a response which, is beautiful. In some ways, very, very beautiful, because people have come out in big numbers. They've been very militant. They have not been hesitant to take over streets, to block entrances and exits of buildings, to prevent ICE from taking people out of workplaces. They've had very, very vigilant, sometimes a little too vigilant, hyper vigilant, reporting to the rapid response lines. And I think everybody's organization that does anything to do with immigrant rights is just kind of overwhelmed with people saying, "What can I do? What can I do? Can I take people groceries? Can I come volunteer? Can I translate documents? Whatever it is. Can I be a rapid response volunteer?" We don't really know what to do with all these people because we don't have time to like vet them and train them and supervise them. We're working on it, right? But it's been really beautiful to see, and I hope we can turn it into something longer term. Because this happened last time, we had like indivisible people coming out, and they were doing some of the same things. But then once Biden got elected, they all went home. So that's where we need real like political education. I don't know, just like pulling out the real values that are drawing people into the streets right now. The values of solidarity and of racial justice and of having a heart and help kind of take people along. There's big differences between like the first outbursts of immigrant rights, enthusiasm, and the community coming out for the trans people that were under attack at the beginning, to like no kings, right? So, where's there room for like a dialogue or holding people's hand and taking them along and say, hey, you might be on the beginning of your political journey, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah, and that's where I think we have evolved quite a bit in the last several years. I mean, for one, we had a huge effort with the rapid response to helping people with the fires, and that culminated in, some of the first examples of seeing massive numbers of people. It was very unruly and in many ways disorganized, and it led to like a lot of transporting of goods from one location back to the other location, and just hyper, like people are just like, I want to get something done, and it was like, yeah, at some point you're digging a hole and then refilling it, and that's the work, and they're just doing that on loop, on end, right? And then we started learning how to like, hey, let's build networks. Because it was like, all right, here's a existing rapid response network, and this thread from this rapid response network populated from 50 people to 800, 900, 1,000 people, and everyone's in the chat asking how they can help. And then we're like, okay, well here, and then it's like, all right, here's quick, educational stuff, and here's another, a local thread for you, or here's a thread on a specific topic, like dealing with hotels. Kind of wild has been, I was listening to It Could Happen Here, and James Stout was talking about the people who are showing up, and he's like, yeah, there's just a ton of like high school children of immigrants who are out there just for the first time. And I'm like, well, we had some kids out there in other past movements too. And then seeing it on the ground, you're like, no, like really, like it's both beautiful and scary, because like you're seeing these 15-year-old kids who are out there with no face covering and nothing to protect them from riot munitions, who are just putting themselves out there and putting themselves in harm's way. And yeah, I mean, like it's not perfect. We still have people that are like not getting connected with the right groups, and naturally what happens then is like people don't get connected with groups at all, or people get connected with RevCom or PSL or some other group that might lead them in a direction they don't want to go into. No shade at some groups, local chapters of certain groups like that can be okay, but generally speaking, I found those groups tend to lead people astray. And, we want to see people showing up and making sure they have the right protective gear on, showing up and making sure that they know how to effectively protect themselves digitally. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that. The other side of things is just communicating our message properly, right? So one of the issues that's been happening right now is like, we have folks showing up the other day to deal with a situation at Dodger Stadium. We had ICE showing up at Dodger Stadium, and the Dodgers have been doing a pretty miraculous, marvelous job of propaganda, and they've been doing that for their entire existence, right? The Dodgers, their stadium is built on a brown community, right? Like they displaced the people of Chavez Ravine, and it's been one thing after another of displacement and harm to these communities ever since. And yet, and still, like, they have a massive following of folks from brown communities, because they've got just a great PR operation going. And like the thing they did immediately when they got called out for having ICE there was, oh, we turned them away. And even like Democracy Now! Ran with that narrative. And there's a lot more to that story. I'll just start with that, right? And we know for a fact, because we have picture and video evidence, that they've been coordinating and showing up to Dodger Stadium property all week. And we have no effective mechanism to combat that. We can come on shows like this, but like when MSNBC and CNN are running with the narrative, and even Democracy Now! Are running with the narrative that the Dodgers ran them out immediately, like then what happens is you have 30 people show up to the protest rather than 300, and there's not really a good way to effectively combat that yet.
With the changes at the federal level, with enforcement around attempting to immediately deport people rather than focusing on putting them through a legal process that you can sort of like intervene with to try to bail people out or get them a lawyer or whatever. How has rapid response shifted with that, and also with the shift with around DACA?
Yeah, so that was a really big change that Trump tried to make the first time around and was challenged, and it was halted. And this time it's been moving forward since pretty much day one of the administration. There's always been expedited removal on the books, but it used to be just if you were within 100 miles of the border and had been or was suspected to have been in the country for less than 2 weeks, they could expel you summarily without any due process, without had any chance to go before a judge. And so now it's not just near the border, it's anywhere in the country. And now it's not just 2 weeks, it's 2 years. So a part of that has been, the kind of preventive side of things in terms of the know your rights and trying to encourage people to know what that policy is, and that if you've been here for less than 2 years, or that for more than 2 years, then to have some way to prove it, or be sure to express it if you're getting taken in. Or if you're afraid of returning, then definitely shouting that from the rooftops, because they ICE and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, no longer have it's no longer incumbent on them to ask. You have to be the one that says it. So with the rights violations, with them just taking people without probable cause, without warrants, without any kind of proof or reasonable suspicion that the person is from somewhere else or doesn't have status, it's been really important to try to get in and do an intake interview as soon as possible, even before there's a bond hearing, because sometimes to get bond, you have to file documents that show identity and stuff like that. And so you could be handing over evidence that the government didn't have in the first place. Whereas if the person had their rights violated and it stood up for their rights and had them violated anyways, then there's potential for like a motion to suppress, motion to terminate, get that person out of removal proceedings entirely, rather than try to fight for them to have bond and fight a deportation case. And not everybody, even immigration attorneys, don't even always know all that stuff, and it's not really that common to do motions to suppress, because of the evidence being gathered was part of the fruit of the forbidden tree. And with the 2-year thing, with the people who are in expedited proceedings, that's tough, because you're not even in court. So you've got to try to find some way, while the person is still detained, before they're expelled from the country, that they've been here for 2 years at least, which sometimes you can do that with pay stubs or leases or whatever, or try to help that person assert their fear of return and maybe support them through if they make a fear of return claim, then they're supposed to be put into they're supposed to have a credible fear interview, and if they have any kind of legal support in that, then that's only going to benefit them. So it's been a struggle to get the legal support, the legal resources up into Adelanto or in the Metropolitan Detention Center, or it's sometimes even harder to get people down to the border and on those calls or video calls or in the detention centers to provide that information, especially when they act very quickly. And they also had just been transferring people around like crazy. Like yesterday, I visited a guy who had been in he was picked up in, I think, Connecticut, and had been in 7 different facilities before he got to Adelanto, and now he's been in Adelanto for 2 months. And they've been picking up people here and sending them to Texas, and meanwhile, they're bringing people from Texas here. None of it makes any sense, but I think part of it is to distance people from their networks of support, their legal counsel, their families that can provide, resources, and generate a lot of confusion. So I think, that's how I would say rapid response has shifted a little bit.
Did you get a chance in there to talk about the differences in Adelanto?
Not really, no. But one big difference is that, we've been fighting against Adelanto before it even opened. So, and I think now it's in year 12. And unfortunately, we lost that fight. It's open. But we've taken on that struggle in other ways, everything from prayer vigils outside to having visitation programs so we can have eyes and ears on the conditions through like church groups and stuff, to litigation and community organizing, old-fashioned pressure campaigns. And we were this close to getting the Adelanto ICE Processing Center shut down. It was under task order, and it was down to 3 people. And then one of them got deported, and it was down to 2 people. And then right before the election, or before the inauguration, the task order was lifted, And the new incoming administration said, there's not going to be any task order here. And so it started filling up. Of course, Geo Group was the main contributor to the Trump campaign. Their stock prices doubled the day of the election, and they're trying to cash in. So it went from that particular facility went from like something like 300 people in just a month ago, or no, that was in April, like end of April. Until last week, it was like at 1,800 something, and now it's at capacity. The capacity is just at under 2,000. There's another facility right next door, Desert View Annex, which holds about 700 or 730 people, something like that. And apparently it's also at capacity, which may be why they're sending other people. And everybody just came in so fast, that the guards couldn't handle it. They lost control. The detainees were the ones themselves organizing the count, because if there's no count, then there's no food, there's no water, there's no, progress. They don't get out for yard time. But the guards didn't like having control, so they were jumping on tables and pointing their pepper ball guns at people, yelling at them, and people didn't have enough clothes. They had only one change of clothes. They couldn't wash it, so they're washing their uniforms with shampoo in the showers. There wasn't enough food. All the food was late. They started running out of water. And I talked to one guy who was scared that because of so many people coming in at the same time and people being desperate, he was concerned that the tension was potentially creating very dangerous conditions. So it seems like it's calmed down a little bit, but they're definitely still struggling. And that has created problems with family being able to visit, family being able to deposit money into their commissary accounts or on their phone accounts, and definitely been a big problem for attorneys and nonprofit legal workers to be able to get in and having the detainees have access to counsel. Huge issue.
Ben, I recall hearing something about the credible threat standards changing under the Biden administration and then the Trump administration taking advantage of that. With regards to like how someone has to like audibly seem like they're in fear rather. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah. So they're not requiring the ICE or CBP to inquire, are you afraid to return, before either detaining them or putting them into an expedited removal process, one. And then two, when they actually do the credible fear, I've talked to colleagues who have had clients in credible fear interviews. They're not even really asking questions. Like it used to be, probably a good hour to do one of these credible fear interviews. Because they're done by asylum officers who are trained to get at the truth of the situation of the people that they're interviewing and find out what their situation is and if they're afraid to return. And now they're taking less than 20 minutes because they're not even really asking the questions.
This last couple of weeks, there's been turmoil in Southern California with federal troops and in some cases law enforcement aiding them, raiding facilities, raiding business places, raiding community spaces, and kidnapping people under the auspices of quote unquote immigration law. And we've seen communities fighting back in really amazing ways. This has been alluded to in some of the prior answers, and I'm sure that most of the audience has seen some of the videos. I guess I don't know if there's any part of that, like federal intervention and community response, that you haven't already referred to that you want to share. Any anecdotes or anything like that?
I guess I'll jump in on this one. And I'll start with the stuff that has preceded everything. Again, a lot of activist communities knew this was coming. And so, and I want to also be clear too, like, I think a lot of people get caught up, and this is why we have these like protest movements that burn hot and then kind of like fizzle out. And I think it's because people get caught up in the glorification of protest itself, and they lose track of the stuff that needs to happen between that, the important stuff like showing up to, and I should say that there's also kind of a distinction between a few different kinds of rapid response, and I'd like to have Ben kind of expand on what I'm about to say with this, but there's like the legal side of rapid response, which is what groups like Churla do, for example. And then there's the side of rapid response that you see from groups in LA. We have, and I want to say that this is like a national, or at least like California wide coalition. There's a coalition called the Community Self-Defense Coalition, and that kind of came out of a group that's been doing this work for a long time called Unión del Barrio. And they encourage pretty direct, like, showing up and confronting ICE raids as they're happening. And like, in a lot of the cases, it's, hey, let's get people to show up into communities at 5 a.m. and just patrol the area and see if you can find some huddle of ICE officers and other federal officers showing up to disperse out to the community and start taking people. And that kind of rapid response is what a lot of activists were like, hey, we want to get these networks going. And so I've definitely personally witnessed local law enforcement, coordinating with federal law enforcement to do some of these kind of raids in some of the communities that I've helped. And I know a lot of other people that have seen similar. Like I mentioned before, I don't remember if we were recording yet or not, but LAPD is a little bit more coy about it because they do have pretty direct policies against doing that. So they'll find ways to weasel word out of that, saying that they were collaborating. And then, so that's been going on for months now. And then it just like exploded. And that's, there was a specific event that led to a bunch of people getting very upset, and that led to these spontaneous protests breaking out. And I also want to mention, now let's bring it forward now and talk about what's going on at the moment, right? Like, people started showing up in the streets and they were very upset, and it was, again, like the children of immigrants and just random Angelenos who were not happy about what was going on in their streets, who had never protested before in many cases, who were just showing up, and plenty of other seasoned activists as well. But it was definitely a huge mobilization of just average Angelenos who are not happy at all about what's going on. And it's also important to mention that these are not the biggest protests by any long stretch that Los Angeles has ever seen. It's also not, like most protests, when there's violence, the violence starts with oftentimes escalations from cops, and we had cops in many cases just randomly shooting less lethal munitions at people and showing up and beating people with their clubs and such. And people responded by, escalating themselves. And so, yeah, you saw the display of people burning Waymos and throwing lime scooters down at cop cars. And, that all happened after the police escalated that. And let me be clear, when I'm talking about the police right now, the vast majority of that violence has been LAPD and LA Sheriff's Department. The National Guard,
when they're not shooting at each other.
Yeah, well, I was going to get to that in a second, actually, which was awesome. So the situation with the National Guard has been like, they've deployed some munitions as well, but for the most part, they're just like standing in front of federal buildings. And the Marines have done even less. They've arrested one person for a very brief period of time. The vast majority of the violence has been police. And, LAPD and LASD have a long history of brutality, both in terms of protests and just in terms of the community in general. And that's, not to say that other law enforcement doesn't, but, definitely LAPD and LASD are pretty notorious for it. And they were all out there, as was CHP. And yeah, we saw that going on. And so that escalated primarily. Let's not let the narrative get out there about like the importance of National Guard and other federal troops. It's been primarily like LAPD, LASD, and then a little bit of CHP brutalizing people, and then, a little bit of assistance from these federal troops, which mainly it's just they're wasting, federal tax dollars and, sending them out here for no reason. Because as Gavin Newsom will definitely point out, he can send LAPD and LASD and CHP to and Karen Bass send these groups to brutalize protesters on their own. They're more than capable of doing so, right? And yeah, like one of the displays that I got to, I definitely, when you mention the law enforcement shooting each other, it was no surprise to me because that was a crowd that was packed in like sardines right by City Hall, doing basically nothing, and cops just started wantonly opening fire on the crowd. So it was completely unsurprising to me that that LASC managed to hit a bunch of LAPD officers in the process. That was quite fun to witness.
The kind of following up on my comment about how sending in the National Guard was just for the purposes of confrontation. I also feel like there was an element of distraction there, because when the community finds out the National Guard is coming, then people want to protest that. They look at that in itself as an abuse, and it is. And so, everybody rushes downtown to where the National Guard is to protest, and, things escalate and whatnot. But meanwhile, we forget about what we were protesting in the first place, which was ICE and all these other federal agencies that they've deputized, stealing people out of the community. And so that particular day, I think it was Saturday, I think it was the 14th, when there was a big mobilization against the National Guard. That was the day they started hitting the car washes. And they were picking up sidewalk vendors over on the west side, and they were very active out here in the inland. And so I think sometimes it's easier to respond, and that's where like the interest is, kind of like the fetishization that was mentioned earlier. But one of my comments was, wouldn't it be a shame if they threw a riot and nobody came? It's not always the most strategic thing to just rush into combat against a very well armed and militarily trained opposition force. And I think that's maybe the hopefully some of the takeaway is, how do we have larger scale coordination? How do we have larger scale discussion strategies? Because I think that's really the only way that we're going to be able to really do things like strikes, boycotts. Like they want to go after people in the fields. Well, the food is going to rot. They want to go after people in the warehouses. Well, those warehouse goods are not going to be moving, and that's going to affect the bosses. And the bosses are going to, they're the ones that the Trumps and all them are listening to anyways, right? The tariffs got dropped the day after he had a meeting with Walmart and Lowe's and whoever else CEO. And, and the other thing is that I don't think that the National Guard, people were worried about them, but those are Californians, they come from our community. They're working class people. They were just looking for a way to get into college or a job. And they do not want to be aiming their guns at us. And I think I saw a great video of, I think it was a former veteran, kind of yelling that at them, like, where are you? You guys are us. And just encouraging them to, to think and to feel and to recognize what they were doing, where their alliances are or should be. And the Marines too, the Marines don't have the best reputation, but they're not the kind of people that want to get deployed against Americans. How much of the rhetoric they're believing that we're all just, I don't know, California illegal terrorists and stuff, I don't know. I'm not really clued into that community, but I don't think we should give up on our the people that are in those forces. I'm not a fan of cops, obviously, but when it comes to National Guard, Army type people, I think we've got to organize on every front that we can.
Yeah, I want to add to just the kind of beginning of that. I maybe have a little bit of a different take on, troops as well, but I'll leave that aside. I would just say that I think that the Trump administration came into the whole thing of them sending ICE to California knowing that this would happen, knowing that it's summertime and this is when protests happen and this would be a great opportunity to cause people to show up in the streets and use it as an opportunity to repress people and try to, rally his base around the idea of normalizing that repression and normalizing also, like, you're starting to see more vehicular attacks at protests, right? You're starting to see people talk about coming and doing violence at protests. I think that there's definitely a part of his playbook that comes down to, I want protests to happen because I want people to show up so that my followers can attack them and I can attack them as well. And I really do think that protests is an important component of all this. And I think Ben surely agrees with that. I think, though, that we both agree that protest is probably best used as an opportunity to get people in when they're agitated and onboard them into largely more meaningful things, right? As we've been talking about, rapid response networks, mutual aid work. These are all the things that build the infrastructure for us to make lasting change in our communities. And also, like, sustainable movements come from people engaging in things that are not putting them constantly at risk of arrest and injury. And so that's, I think, really important, is like that I think we're starting to find more and more ways to get people who are on the ground doing that to see that fact. I'm seeing a lot of those people that are showing up in the streets mad, funneling themselves into rapid response networks right now, these like very informal, unvetted ones. And then we're like, hey, by the way, if you want to get closer with people who are really, really doing this work, here's a training that you can go to. And so I think that we're seeing the beginnings of some of that stuff. I think that's really important. And yeah, I definitely think that him deploying the National Guard and him deploying the troops was absolutely more a tactic to get more people out in the streets and give them an opportunity to show that, the reasons why he needs to repress people.
Some immigrant solidarity organizations have been focusing on Know Your Rights trainings to prepare for raids and for door knocks and stuff. And one interesting approach that I've been seeing, like Siembra in the Triangle in North Carolina has been doing, among many other groups, has been to focus on places of employment, with the like training up employers who may be invested either socially, personally, politically, or definitely economically in their workers. Are you familiar with how this approach has been working, considering the shift in the way that raids are being conducted, and what sort of secondary outcomes are raised by this? Like, are employers and their class like getting a little more invested maybe in the workers that they rely on to make all their money?
Well, I think the employing class has always basically been pro-immigrant and even pro-immigration reform. The last time there was actually a reform bill that came close to passing, the BizFed and all the Chamber of Commerce's and all them were all for it. It was a block of Congress members, mostly in the Midwest, in predominantly white districts, that didn't say they were doing it, opposing it for racial reasons, but it was very clearly a racial issue. So I don't think that's new. It has been interesting to see the way that some employers have actually, stepped up and defended their workers. I can't say that it's because it's anything that me or the organizations that I am aware of have done to reach out to them and kind of train them. Because when we've done workplace KYR, workplace or worker-oriented trainings, it's been about worker solidarity and in collaboration with unions or ununionized workers, and not so much with the employers, because the employers don't really like us also telling them about workers' rights. But I have seen it, and I've talked to warehouse workers who were at work when their boss said, hey, the migra's outside, so we're locking the door and we're telling them to go away, and you guys just sit tight, and we're going to pay you for the day, and as soon as it's safe to go, you guys can go, but go out the back door, carpool, that sort of thing. So that was really cool to see, and also interesting to see that but it's not coming out of the movement. It's not coming out of a vision of justice or migrant justice. I think it's coming out of more of self-interest, and right now being the cool boss so that I can keep my workers, and they're going to have a debt of gratitude to me or whatever, and not unionize or not demand a fair wage and that sort of thing. I don't know. That's just kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I was going to mention the cynical side of it, because there's I was watching some local news, and they were actually showing some video from a raid, and it was wild to see this. They're like talking to this boss, and like, yeah, he's been talking about how he's going to have, he's shocked that that so many people just lied to him on their applications, and now he's going to have to replace his entire workforce. And I'm like, so they all lied to you about the fact that about the facts of their immigration status, and you hired all of them, and I guess you're really quite the dupe here, huh? I'm shocked that I have all these immigrants working for me. It's there's definitely a cynical side to all that, is all I'm pointing out.
Oh yeah,
there's also the predatory side, which is something that has been coming out about the Ambience Apparel raid that happened. It was that same day, the 13th, or the 12th or 13th, where the worker, once they're getting processed in and whatnot, they're being told that their boss was under investigation for money laundering, and so they're suspicion is that the boss reached some kind of deal with federal law enforcement that he would just sell out his workers, let them take the workers, and he would get some kind of, deal and not in prosecution or reduce charges or something like that for whatever he was really under investigation for. And you've seen that before where they're supposedly investigating the employer, even for something like I-9 violations or hiring workers without status. And the workers are the ones that get taken, and the boss, nothing happens to him.
Yeah, and I know CBP and DHS in various cases have been caught actually collaborating in those kind of things in the past. So
I really appreciate the time that you've taken to have this conversation. And you've kind of pointed to some lessons about trying to not focus necessarily on the glamorous, maybe in some cases macho elements of the protests, trying to use the opportunity of people being riled up to get them trained up, to keep them from making basic mistakes, but try to get them to think deeper about the involvement and what resistance needs to look like to make effective change. This is me kind of putting words in your mouths, but kind of one thing that I got out of some of the stuff that you said. But I wonder if there's any other lessons that you want to point to in these last couple of minutes from I will say it was spectacular, but also really impressive resistance that was seen in streets around Southern California recently.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to definitely add one more thing where it's there's also the way that you go about protests. And so one of the most effective things that we saw during this was people going after hotels, right? So there were hotels where ICE was being housed. And a lot of these hotels, they knew that ICE was coming or that ICE was there and, didn't seem to care until the community came out and were like, hey, we're not okay with this. And in many cases, we effectively got them to kick ICE out of the hotels. And it was interesting, too, because that was effective. But then there were also several of those protests that weren't very effective for a variety of reasons. And then you saw autonomous community members coming forward and giving these critiques, written down critiques to those groups of people, hey, here are some of the ones that have been more effective. And they talked about when folks are having these late night and there's specific communities where they really force sound ordinances past 10 p.m. And they were in particular, this one protest was, starts at 9 p.m. They're like, hey, let's bring these sound, these noisemakers and let's do this, let's make sound. And then at the first night of it, they did that. And then they, really cracked down on the noise ordinances and people were first of all, it's there's some degree where there's clearly some people who are new and a little bit scared. So they actually listen to the cops, rather than defying that. And then there's the other side of it where it's it was because of the fact that they listened, they ended up, all right, we're going to go ahead and do this a cappella, and it became a little less effective. Less people were showing up at the night ones. Also, you're not showing up when people are outside and can see and you can talk to people at the hotel about what's going on. And so they gave that critique and they're like, well, these other protests have been effective because of this, or this particular protest, you changed that strategy and then that ended up working. And so it was really cool to see this pretty much in real time, critique of that and to some extent people listening to that and using new tactics to good effect. So.
I agree that the hotels is an example of creativity and agility. And I think if our movements want to be successful, we definitely got to be creative and agile. They were also some of those hotel actions were also a lot of fun. And so it helps us to bring joy into the movement and our actions too. And I think just another one that we should always kind of remember is that the borders are made to benefit corporations and the oligarchs. And so the more transnational, international solidarity we have, the better off we all are. And, especially with the climate crisis, it affects all of us. And it's not a new idea. It's an old idea, but it's really about labor. It's about workers being protected and having access to the fruit of their labor. So, if the corporations can be multinational, then why can't the worker organizations also? And they should be. And so it's an old idea that maybe we just need to bring back in.
Well put. All right. Thank you so much for having this conversation and for the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks. It's been great.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Now on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network, tune into The Beautiful Idea,
a project from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles,
as well as original commentary and analysis.
Episodes include action news, interviews with frontline organizers, and deep dive discussions.
Check out thebeautifulidea.show and the Channel Zero network for more information.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Vance Bolter really screwed up Minnesota's weekend last week. He dressed up as a cop and went to the home of one lawmaker, shooting him and his wife, then went to another lawmaker's home, killing her and her husband. At that residence, he got into a shootout with the cops and fled on foot. So investigators had access to Bolter's car, where they found a long list of prospective victims, a whole lot of guns and ammo, and of course, a manifesto. Why does everybody feel the need to write manifestos? Or is it just that when those in power find anything written by a perceived enemy, they call it a manifesto? I guess really, Bolter could have just had a grocery list. And I wonder how many manifestos the ODRC would say I've written. Maybe this is a manifesto. A manifesto. I don't know. I digress. I have 11 observations about this incident that you will not hear anywhere else. I'll number them for you. 1. They caught dude on Monday morning in the woods. Reporting indicates that he's militantly pro-life and went after pro-choice politicians. Seems pretty ironic that a guy who was that pro-life had that many guns in his car. I've always thought of guns as more of a pro-death kind of an item myself. 2. One of the interesting aspects of this case is that he dressed up as a cop when he went to lawmakers' homes. He must have fooled them since they opened their doors to him. But it should have been pretty obvious that this guy wasn't a Minneapolis police officer. If he was the real thing, he'd be kneeling on a black man's neck. 3. While he was still on the loose, I took to social media and told everyone that in an abundance of caution, if they encounter anyone in police uniform, they should shoot. You know, in an abundance of caution. But I was just kidding, of course. Seriously suggesting that someone shoot cops can get you kicked off a Fed book. They're picky like that. 4. The lawmakers he shot were Democrats and were then presumably in favor of gun control legislation. Ironic that their Republican colleagues, who likely opposed gun control, are still alive and have to pretend like they're grieving for the gun control advocates who were shot. 5. And if you think the shooting of lawmakers will get us any closer to gun control, just keep dreaming. A few years back, Republican whip in the U.S. House, Steve Scalise, was shot during the House Republican team baseball practice. He bled all over second base. He's consistently blocked gun control since then, casting his vote and walking from the booth with a noticeable limp. 6. Over the same weekend that Vance Bolter shot 2 lawmakers and their spouses, gripping the nation in endless news cycles, several black men in the city of Chicago, just a few hundred miles south of Minnesota, died in preventable gun violence. The guns that shot those black men in Chicago were just as lethal as the guns fired by Bolter. More so, perhaps, given the body count. None of those killed had their pictures on CNN or Fox News. There was no manhunt for their killers. But 2 white suburban lawmakers were virtually tattooed to our retinas. Hashtag privileged lives matter. 7. I don't have the stats on this, but based on reading the names of those shot by cops in previous years, it's a good bet that over the same weekend those lawmakers were shot, more than 2 people were killed by cops. That means real police kill more victims than fake police, even when the fake police had a manifesto and a kill list. 8. The response to these shootings of lawmakers has been a resounding denunciation of political violence by the governmental, political, and media representatives alike. The key phrase they keep repeating is that America is not the place for political violence. But isn't it? Didn't the U.S. gain its sovereignty by shooting redcoats? Didn't Aaron Burr kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel? Haven't 4 presidents been assassinated? And failed presidential assassinations. Didn't Teddy Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan each survive one? And didn't Gerald Ford and Donald Trump survive 2 apiece? That doesn't even include the governmental sponsored violence, the conquest of land through genocide, the legalization of slavery, cops shooting people, and continual wars and military hardware shipped everywhere to kill, kill, kill. 9. Realistically, I can't think of any place more associated with political violence than the United States. Any place. So why are we supposed to pretend that political violence doesn't happen here? Why is everyone who influences what we think attempting to convince us of something wholly divergent from historical reality? 10. I have a theory. Want to hear it? People in power don't want to get shot. Every time an event like this occurs where a subject, otherwise powerless, goes outside the prescribed remedies for redressing their complaints, whoever the subject may be, whatever their politics, whatever their complaints, there is a brief moment, a glitch in the matrix, an opening perhaps, a suspension in our mass hallucination, a breach where we all blink and maybe wonder, why are we putting up with this? Why are we obeying? Why are we working and shopping and dying when it's just that easy to say no? And if that idiot can do that, and that's the reason they must repeat a provable lie again and again, to rock us back to sleep, to convince us we didn't see anything of any importance, to make us even feel empathy for those poor victims. Pretty blonde dead woman, stare at the photo, feel empathy, go back to sleep, nothing to see here. The truth is, rights are never given, they're taken. Freedom is only gained when you take it from those who withhold it. America is not the place for political violence. America is not the place for political violence. America is not the place for political violence. 11. If political violence isn't the answer, maybe we're all asking the wrong questions. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're asking the right questions, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.